Hey guys, welcome to episode 233 of Stand Up. Joining me today to talk about the future of Alaska's wilderness, the executive director of the Alaska Wilderness League, Adam Kolton, and one of my favorite new writers, commentators, Jared Yates Sexton, joins me for a wide-ranging conversation as well. I am Pete Dominic. It's time to stand up with me right now. Hello and welcome to the show, which is here every day talking about all of the important issues that matter to you, your family, your community, your country, and your planet with the experts who really know their stuff. That's what I do every day here on Stand Up. Thank you very much for your support. Let's start today's conversation with a tweet from Conan O'Brien, who, by the way, announced he would be leaving TBS to do a variety show on HBO, which is really exciting. But Conan tweeted, "Remember, you need to start quarantining today for Thanksgiving, then keep quarantining, and then not go." Just a great way to start the show and to start the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And I love the advice and jokes of Conan O'Brien. All right, lots to discuss with you today. First, COVID, then election, and then whatever else I can get to that's random. But let's give you the headlines on the pandemic, shall we? Should we just dive right into it, rip the Band-Aid right off, get to the good stuff? And there is actually some good stuff. Let's start in Iowa, where the pandemic has spiked. The governor has finally put in a mask mandate, even though she resisted for a really long time. And Senator Chuck Grassley, who's 87 years old, he's been in the United States Senate since the Hoover administration. He tested positive for COVID, missed his first roll call in 27 years. Best wishes, Senator Grassley. Now let's head over to Maryland, where the Republican governor, Larry Hogan, is pleading with people who are, quote, non-believers. According to CBS Baltimore, Governor Larry Hogan is pleading with Marylanders, is that how you pronounce it, to help prevent the spread of COVID. Maryland Governor Larry Hogan implored residents to take the actions needed to help prevent the spread of coronavirus as the state saw more than 2,000 new cases for the second day this month. He said, "This is not the flu. It's not fake news. It's not going to magically disappear just because we're all tired of it and we want our normal lives back." During a press conference on Tuesday, he said, "We're in a war right now and the virus is winning." All right, that's a little bit from Iowa, a little bit from Maryland. Apparently, if you live in California now, you are not allowed to go bareface outside your home unless you're the governor and you're going to a party with your friends. Gavin Newsom got in some hot water for that. Really bad move. Oh, what an unforced error. Californians now must mask up outside their homes under a new expanded mandate because of a startling spike in coronavirus cases. According to Yahoo News, California health officials issued a new mandate this week requiring residents to wear face coverings whenever they're outside their homes, with very few exceptions. Now let's head back to the Midwest and go to Ohio, where starting Thursday, Ohioans will be under a 3-week overnight curfew, heading off shutdown for right now. For at least 3 weeks starting Thursday, Ohioans will be under curfew with some exceptions from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. to stem the spread of coronavirus. I'm not sure how that's going to be that effective, but I haven't really thought it through. 3-week curfew in Ohio. All right, now let's go next door to Pennsylvania. They're strengthening their mask mandate, recovering COVID-19 testing for travelers amid a coronavirus surge. New COVID-19 safety precautions from Pennsylvania Health Department say mandating masks and anyone entering Pennsylvania must get a COVID test within 72 hours or quarantine for 2 weeks. This comes as the state reported 5,900 new daily coronavirus cases. Numbers have jumped 115% in just 2 weeks. All right, let's get out of Pennsylvania and head out to North Dakota, where that state has sadly recorded the world's highest COVID-19 mortality rate. North Dakota's coronavirus mortality rate is the highest of any U.S. state or country, according to analysis of data from last week conducted by the Federation of American Scientists. The analysis, first reported by the Huffington Post, shows that North Dakota has a rate of 18.2 deaths per 1 million people. South Dakota, meanwhile, has 17.4 deaths per million, the third worst rate in the world. The states have a total population of under 2 million, and all news out of North or South Dakota always begs the question, why are there two Dakotas? We really should combine them and lessen their impact on the stupid electoral college if we must continue to have it. And good friend of mine, friend of the show, Dr. Aaron Carroll, writing an opinion piece in today's New York Times titled, "Are we seriously talking about closing schools again?" That's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing right now. Dr. Carroll writes, "As the surge of coronavirus infections in the United States becomes undeniable, many leaders throughout the country are reacting by calling for closures. Bizarrely, they almost always seem to focus on schools first. That's exactly the opposite of what they should be doing. Don't get me wrong, with cases climbing to levels we haven't seen before, we need to restrict our physical interactions, but we should do so rationally in an evidence-based manner. We should figure out what poses the greatest danger and act accordingly, instead of automatically asking school children to bear the brunt of the pain." He goes on to make the case in this excellent New York Times opinion piece, but he closes by saying, because schools are not the major cause of the problem, shutting them down won't do enough on its own to slow the spread of disease. When, not if, businesses are forced to shutter temporarily in the near future, we can tide them over with money, and we absolutely should. When schools are closed, however, handing students a check will not replace what they've lost. American adults have failed in almost every way imaginable in this pandemic. None of it is kids' fault. When we try and fix this latest mess, let's put their needs first. Dr. Carroll in today's New York Times. All right, that's the coronavirus pandemic section of today's opening. And by the way, lots of people writing me saying that they love the opening, and that makes me feel great. I could not have a higher compliment right now, other than generally the work is great, but specifically because I put a lot of work into getting as much information and having as much fun as I can with this opening segment, which is getting better all the time. But thank you to Stephen O, who emailed me at standupwithpete@gmail.com and said, subject, show intro. Love the news roundup you're doing at the beginning of every show. Entertaining and insightful. Stephen, thank you. That is what I'm going for, Stephen O. I really appreciate that email. And any little email or tweet, it all means a lot. Compliments or criticism, keep it coming. I don't have a producer. I don't have an editor. I just got you. Invest in the show, invest in independent media, and sign up for a paid subscription, by the way. Join me tomorrow night for a hangout. That's right, 8 p.m. Thursday, the 19th. I hope that you'll join me for a hangout, 8 p.m. You got to be a subscriber. Just go to the paid subscription link or patreon.com/Pete Dominic, and I hope to see you there. All right, let's get to some of the political news and some of the crazy developments that happened, because, of course, crazy is still our name as long as we have a maniac in the Oval Office who wants to sell it all off, burn it all down, and take whatever he can and escape with some semblance of freedom or future in his grasp. If you're like me, you really want to know the answer to the question, can America restore the rule of law without prosecuting the worst criminal we've potentially ever seen in politics and many of his cronies? I think we cannot. I think we absolutely have to prosecute him. I realize that would be very divisive, but the Department of Justice under Joe Biden is going to have to take a look at a whole bunch of crimes committed by this administration and investigate them, as will state attorneys general, like in New York State. But the question remains, what will happen? And Joe Biden signaled on Tuesday that he hopes to avoid divisive Trump investigations. He prefers unity. Biden has apparently told aides he's concerned that investigations would divide the country, but that would leave decisions up to an independent Justice Department. Well, I'll be discussing that with a lot of people. I'd love to know what you think about it as well. NBC News reporting this. President-elect Joe Biden has privately told advisors he doesn't want his presidency to be consumed by investigations of his predecessor, according to 5 people familiar with the discussions, despite pressure from some Democrats who want inquiries into President Donald Trump, his policies, and members of his administration. So you're already hearing the left outraged about that from my friend Sam Cedar on the Majority Report, and plenty of others as well. So that, I think, is a big story, an important story, and we'll follow that. It's right now just anonymously sourced reporting, and maybe it's just a trial balloon. But what do you think? I'd love to know. standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, another political news. Top Republicans starting to publicly throw in the towel, reads the headline at Mediaite on the Trump re-election, that is. Although the president hasn't shown any signs he's ready to concede, top members of the Republican Party begin to throw in the towel on his election. Several top Republicans, including Senator John Cornyn, Senator Roger Wicker, Senator Kevin Cramer, Senator Marco Rubio all recognize that President-elect Joe Biden has indeed won the election while talking to reporters. While Cornyn suggested that President Donald Trump should continue his legal challenges, he admitted that he has, quote, every confidence on January 20 we're going to inaugurate a president, and it'll probably be Joe Biden. I haven't seen anything that would change the outcome, he added. More comments. Vice President Biden ought to be getting briefings, and the transition ought to be in the works so that there's an infrastructure for that. And if he ends up winning, as it seems likely he will, that he won't have to get caught up one day in January. That's according to Senator Cramer. Anyway, they're starting to come around, Republicans in Congress. I doubt that is happening in right-wing media, although I haven't paid attention to it the last couple of days as much as I actually normally do to see what they're saying and thinking about whether or not the president should concede. And obviously he is not going to concede. But what is right-wing media saying about it? I don't know. Other two big stories on Tuesday were that President Trump fired his Department of Homeland Security cybersecurity official for comments defending his election as secure. He was fired for contradicting the president of the United States, and the world went crazy on Tuesday night. Catherine Watson tweeted, fired for telling the truth and instilling faith in our elections just because Trump didn't get his way. By the way, Trump fired him on Twitter. Where do I even need to read his stupid tweet? Caitlin Collins at CNN. If you want to know why officials are hesitant to recognize obvious truths like Joe Biden won the election and Donald Trump didn't, Chris Krebs is a prime example of how, in this White House, you can be fired for contradicting the president, even if he is wrong. And Chris Krebs, to his own credit, speaking out, again, the director of cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, Chris Krebs, speaking out on Twitter Tuesday night after being fired on Twitter by President Trump. He, of course, debunked a number of conspiracy theories related to the election, some that have been floated by the president directly and some which the president even repeated in his tweets, firing Chris Krebs. On his personal Twitter account, he wrote, honored to serve. We did it right. Defend today, secure tomorrow, hashtag protect 2020. And CNN's Jake Tapper reported that Krebs found out about his firing from the tweet. Jake Tapper tweeted, a source close to Chris Krebs says he always knew he might get in trouble for telling the truth while the president was spreading lies and conspiracy theories about the election. That said, Krebs realized he might be fired when in recent days, media organizations that tend to do the bidding of the Trump White House started taking shots at him, and word spread that the White House was going to start attacking him personally. Krebs learned he had been fired when he read the president's tweet this evening. Jake Tapper, with a source close to Chris Krebs. That means it's Chris Krebs, by the way. When you see a source close to, it generally means the actual subject. It's not a source close to. That's when you know you're important. People are referring to you as a source close to you. Also tweeting in reaction to the firing, Marcy Wheeler at Empty Wheel says, every single elected Republican who remains silent about the firing of Chris Krebs is putting party over country. Yeah, nothing new there, Marcy. Andrea Mitchell tweets, at Real Donald Trump fires DHS head of election security agency Chris Krebs for reporting accurately that there was no widespread fraud or systemic problems in the election. Really? For not buying into Trump's conspiracy theories? Who's next? Steve Vladeck, who's been on the show, constitutional law expert, writes, Chris Krebs is a person of the highest intellect, integrity, and commitment to the national security of the United States, as reflected, among lots of other things, in his commitment to tell the truth about the 2020 election. We're worse off as a country for Trump's temper tantrum. And one more tweet to react to the firing of Chris Krebs, because he had integrity and the president doesn't, comes from Clint Watts, who was on this show yesterday. He says, thanks, Chris Krebs and team, for protecting election most secure in U.S. history during worst times, protected by someone president appointed and is now fired. Conspiracy after conspiracy been shot down online and in court. Too late for POTUS. Only thing worse than loser is a sore loser. At Selected Wisdom, Clint Watts listened to his interview on this show yesterday, by the way. All right, and what the hell happened in Michigan last night? That is the other big political story from the last 24 hours. Last night in Michigan, within the same time period of day that President Trump fired Chris Krebs, we found out that Republican members of a key Michigan elections board refused to certify Detroit's election results in a nakedly partisan effort to hold up Joe Biden's victory over President Trump. Then they later reversed themselves after a major outcry from the city's voters and state officials. But it was crazy for a couple of hours last night. Chris Hayes over on MSNBC called up the Secretary of State of Michigan and had her come on. And by the way, three powerful women in Michigan, all Democrats, Gretchen Whitmer and the Attorney General, as well as the Secretary of State in Michigan, all strong, smart women who weren't going to allow this to happen. Nonetheless, here is Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, explaining what had happened and why she wasn't going to stand for it on MSNBC with Chris Hayes last night.
It really is disheartening when you consider, obviously, that this is a majority black city, the largest jurisdiction in the state of Michigan. And here are two individuals going far beyond their role to invalidate the votes of tens of thousands of African Americans in the state of Michigan. I
just want to be clear here that the two individuals here, William Hartman, who is a member of that board of canvassers, Monica Palmer, those are the two individuals there who are basically saying, nope, we will not sign off on this free and fair election in this state. It's not just them. I mean, this is the Michigan Republican chair, Laura Cox, saying, I am proud that due to the efforts of the Michigan GOP and the RNC under the leadership of Ronna McDaniel, enough evidence of irregularities and potential voter fraud was uncovered, resulting in the Wayne County Board of Canvassers refusing to certify their election results. This seems to be a top-to-bottom coordinated effort by the Republican state party in your state.
Yeah, not only that, it's not true. I mean, there were not irregularities or any indication of fraud that was discussed today. It was instead clerical errors that will now go to the Bureau of Elections, which falls under my office, to fully address, and we will. But there's no indication that any votes were wrongly tabulated or that any invalid votes existed or were tabulated. I mean, this is really just a clerical issue that will be resolved by the state and nothing more than an attempt to misuse these roles to play partisan politics and cause confusion, which, again, is kind of, the norm that we've seen throughout this election.
All right, thanks to Chris Hayes and MSNBC for that clip. Good reporting, great guest at the best time. And of course, before Chris Hayes' show is over, news broke that the Wayne County electors reversed their decision. And why? Because they were swamped with callers on the Zoom call that two smart Democrats who got a word that this might happen, Rashida Tlaib and Debbie Dingell, started urging people in Metro Detroit to start making calls around at 1:30 p.m. to join the Wayne County Board of Canvassers meeting. And guess what? They did. And one guy went absolutely viral. Ned Stabler is his name. He's the chief executive of TechTown, a high-tech business incubator in Detroit and a poll challenger at TCS Center in the city. And he was on that Zoom call. And this is what he had to say about William Hartman and Monica Palmer. And man, did this clip go viral. Ned Stabler, hashtag Trump stink.
I just want to let you know that the Trump stink, the stain of racism that you, William Hartman and Monica Palmer, have just covered yourself in, is going to follow you throughout history. Your grandchildren are going to think of you like Bull Connor or George Wallace. Monica Palmer and William Hartman will forever be known in southeastern Michigan as two racists who did something so unprecedented that they disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of black voters in the city of Detroit because they were ordered to. Probably, I know, Monica, you think Q told you to do it or some other crazy stuff like that. But just know when you try to sleep tonight that millions of people around the world now on Twitter know the name Monica Palmer and William Hartman as two people completely racist and without an understanding of what integrity means or a shred of human decency. The law isn't on your side, history won't be on your side, your conscience will not be on your side, and Lord knows, when you go to meet your maker, your soul is going to be very, very warm.
Oh, Ned Stabler on fire right there. And just so nobody's confused with what I have said, those two people reversed themselves and voted to certify election results after initial deadlock. And thank goodness they did, because there would have been a riot and I would have been encouraging that. Seriously, you cannot take all of the black voters of Detroit and throw their votes out. You can't do it. And if you do it, expect there to be violence. And I love this tweet from CBS and New York Times' Jamel Bowie. Voter fraud is just the latest way to say black votes shouldn't count. Come on, son. All right, now let's head to Pennsylvania, shall we, for the final political story of today's opening. And that is where we've found Donald Trump's last hope, Rudy Giuliani, arguing in court in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, who rejected Trump and Giuliani's claim that Republicans lacked access to Philadelphia's vote count proceedings. The ruling was 5-2 against the campaign. And the two people who voted for were not for it. It's kind of hard to explain, but they thought it was so preposterous that they voted that it was moot. I think I might have that right, and I might not. But it seems that the Trump campaign's hope for any changes in Pennsylvania, at least with this latest attempt, I think they're like 0 for 20 right now. And the judges are just laughing them out of court. I mean, I shouldn't say that. It's not funny. It's dangerous as hell, but they're losing, and that's good news. Oh, here it is from Mark Joseph Stern at Slate. The decision was 5-2 in Pennsylvania because two justices wouldn't have even decided the case, referring to rule that it is moot. The principal dissent also explicitly says that throwing out valid ballots would not be an appropriate remedy anyway. This is a total loss for the Trump campaign in Pennsylvania. All right, and here is a quick news dump before we get to my first guest to talk about the very important issue of Alaska's Arctic Refuge and why we can't allow for the Trump administration to destroy it on the way out. All right, news dump. Nearly 90,000 sex abuse claims have been filed against the Boy Scouts of America. Oh, my God. Nearly 90,000 sexual abuse claims were submitted against Boy Scouts of America ahead of a Monday deadline in the organization's bankruptcy case. The number of sex abuse cases still underreported. Wow. Most powerful Atlantic hurricane of 2020 has made landfall in Nicaragua. Hurricane Iota, is that what it's called? Made landfall in Nicaragua late Monday as extremely dangerous Category 4 storm, packing maximum sustained winds of 155 miles an hour. Windy, by the way, outside the shed right now. I'm getting a little scared for the third night in a row. Very, very windy here. Moving on, news dump. Vaccine hopes are powering Wall Street. The NCAA basketball's eyeing a one-city tournament. Indianapolis is going to be potentially the bubble for March Madness. Trump apparently is going to follow through with cutting troops in Afghanistan, but not to zero. The U.S. military has roughly 4,500 troops in Afghanistan, and so he's going to cut troop levels in both Afghanistan and Iraq to 2,500 by January 15th. What a weird and shitty thing to do with just 2 weeks left to go, which is basically everything he does every day. Weird and shitty. Oh, and here's a happy story to end the news segment. A 9-year-old boy, missing for 2 days, was found Tuesday in a creek bed beneath a shelter he created with a tarp. Jordan Gorman was last seen Sunday at home in Ashland City outside Nashville, Tennessee. After multiple search teams scoured the heavily wooded area near his home, he was found Tuesday afternoon about 3/4 of a mile away, according to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. He was cold and hungry, but otherwise in pretty good spirits, they said in a tweet. Pretty innovative young 9-year-old, and it's encouraging to hear that a kid that young could survive like that. Good for that kid. That's very impressive. Free-range parenting, it works. I mean, sometimes your kids go missing, but shit, they'll survive. I'm sorry. And that is your stand-up news dump, brought to you by GiveWell, givewell.org/standup. If you want your charitable donation to help as much as possible, but you don't know where you can give to make the biggest difference, how much to give, go to givewell.org/standup right now. Coming up at about 44 minutes into the show, my conversation with Jared Yates Sexton, really great, as always. But my first guest is joining me to talk about a super important issue. This morning, I was reading Emily Atkins' Heated, which I subscribe to, her newsletter, and saw this headline that Trump is trying to lock in oil leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge before leaving office. This is a story I've been following and been concerned about from the night Donald Trump got elected. You always worry that when Republicans are in charge of the federal government, they're going to open up public lands that have been earmarked for conservation for development so people can make money, so their rich donors can cut down trees and mine and drill and tear up the natural habitat. And the Arctic Wildlife Refuge is one of the most important and pristine places in all of the world, and probably the largest pristine, untouched part of nature in all of the United States of America. It's such a beautiful place. It's a place I've always wanted to visit. Maybe you've gone. I'd love to hear from you if you have, but there's so much to see and to do, and more important, it's nature's. It belongs to nature. I've read about it. I've talked with people about it. I've watched documentaries about it. I care deeply about it. The forest there is so important to the climate, to collecting carbon, and so much more. And I talk a lot about that with Adam Kolton, who joins me. He's the executive director of the Alaska Wilderness League, and I wanted to bring him on to talk about the importance of his work and this issue. And he joins me right now as my first guest on today's Stand Up. Okay, so really important issue that I've just explained a little bit, but I want to continue and just take a look at how important this piece of land is that I'm going to be talking about with my next guest. The Arctic Refuge is one of the last vast expanses of wilderness in the United States of America. 19 million acres is a size I can't even fathom, mostly untouched by people, home instead to all kinds of nature, caribou, polar bears, migrating waterfowl, and it's always been protected by environmentalists, but it's always had interest for developers, gas, oil, and the logging industry. President Trump, as part of his whole plan here, has decided to open up Alaska for sale, and I'm shorthanding that. But here to talk to me about it is a guy who's spent most of his career protecting this piece of land, the executive director of the Alaska Wilderness League. They are alaskawild.org, and I've been doing all my research on this awesome organization and my guest, and I highly recommend you support him with a donation. Adam Kolton, great to meet you and see you, and thank you for joining me to talk about this.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Pete.
You've been working on this issue and in this part of the country for a really long time. Can you give me a little bit of a history of what you guys have accomplished and what you're most concerned about, having lost with Trump and a Republican Congress selling off this pristine piece of land?
You know, Pete, this is an area that the oil industries wanted to have access to. When you think of Alaska's Arctic coast, it's 1,100 miles, and all but this one area has been made available for oil and gas exploration and development. So this is sort of really the last 5% of Alaska's northern coastal landscape that had protections before President Trump took office. But what he did was in 2017, the GOP jammed a provision in the tax bill that mandated oil leasing in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge for the first time. So this place has been protected since President Eisenhower, since 1960, never had any kind of oil and gas development allowed. But we're facing the prospect of that in the final days of the Trump administration and fighting tooth and nail to make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah, so in 2017, you mentioned in a reversal of 4 decades of protections, the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress opened the refuge's coastal plain to potential gas and oil development, which is what you just said. But now, on Monday, the Federal Register has done something called Call for Nominations from the Bureau of Land Management. They're basically auctioning off this land now in the lame duck session. Is that what I'm hearing? Do I have that right?
Look, in the final days of the Trump administration, they're trying to ram through everything off the oil industry's wish list, and this is one they hadn't gotten done yet. Obviously, they were counting on another term to finish this stuff up. So stuff that normally takes a lot longer with a lot more process, they're rushing it through. And their hope is to have an oil and gas lease sale literally days before President Biden takes office, to really turn over mineral rights and put them in the hands of oil companies and make our job all that much tougher as we work to protect this area and ensure that that oil and gas development doesn't move forward. But not only are they trying to have a lease sale, I think even just as worrisome, maybe more so, is they're trying to green light a seismic exploration of this area. So allowing crews of workers, trucks, heavy equipment, all kinds of industrial activity in the Arctic Refuge at the heart of polar bear denning season, and potentially to do that in early January as well. So we're kind of fighting on two fronts, stopping an oil and gas lease sale and stopping seismic trucks and heavy equipment from invading this area and leaving lasting impact both on the tundra, threatening polar bear dens, and doing a lot of long-term damage.
So who have you and other organizations like yours been fighting for years now? Because it seems like it's the American Petroleum Institute, which is the industry group that represents the oil industry in America. They're the main opponent, but it seems like there's a lot of issues with the logging industry as well, wanting in here and to develop and make money out of this pristine, protected, amazing piece of nature in America. Tell me, and now when a Republican government takes over at the Interior Department and all the way down, BLM and all those report, it's now being run not by people who are concerned about protecting the environment, but by people whose main concern is profiting off the environment. Help me understand who your opponents are and what they've accomplished.
Pete, you're absolutely right that you're not just talking about the oil and gas industry in Southeast Alaska. I think you're really talking about the fact that the Tongass National Forest, often called America's Amazon, this incredible temperate rainforest of 17 million acres, it's a place that a lot of Americans go when they experience Alaska, whether on a cruise ship or some of the different communities in Southeast Alaska. That area, the Trump administration is trying to exempt from protections of unroaded areas in our national forests that have been in place since the Clinton administration in 2001. So that's simultaneously happening, giving the logging industry access to the Tongass National Forest, these incredible old growth trees, allowing the oil industry and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We're definitely fighting on multiple fronts. In terms of the interests here, I mean, there are oil companies that are doing business in Alaska, and the state of Alaska, its political leaders, there's an interest in, frankly, keeping oil and gas going as long and as hard as possible. There's a huge amount of oil and gas activity in Alaska. There's decades worth of oil still to flow down the pipeline, but there's a reckoning. I mean, there's a transition coming. I mean, we've got to deal with the climate crisis, and we can't plan for 50 to 100 years more oil and gas development in Alaska or, frankly, elsewhere around the world. We've got to begin this transition in earnest. And there are interests that economic interests, both in the state and outside of it, that are reluctant to want to recognize that we've got to start shifting and reluctant to say, hey, we've got to draw a line. And if we start going into the most wild, remote landscapes on the planet for a speculative fix of oil that had come online 10, 12 years from now and stay online for 50 years or so. That's what the Trump administration says, 50, 60 years of production. I mean, how are we going to begin to tackle the climate crisis? And it's such a paradox when you've got Alaska facing some of the worst impacts of climate change. And some of those impacts are making it awfully hard to even do business in Alaska. The oil infrastructure is unstable. The tundra is melting. Communities are falling into the sea. And areas that you mentioned that are vulnerable to logging, like the Tongass National Forest, are great natural carbon sinks. I mean, they absorb carbon and actually help all of us deal with the impacts of emissions better because they're sucking them up. So we really need to begin looking at Alaska not for its oil and its timber, but as a solution of the climate crisis, and think more about a sustainable economic future.
Your organization works with and on behalf of Native people, but it's my understanding that public opinion is split. It's confusing, I think, probably even to the public in Alaska. But if you're an Alaskan resident, it's like socialism there. You get a check for all the oil that your state produces. And I think that's something that there's probably something to that as to why people want to see some of this land opened up, including some tribal people that are divided on it as well, which I was really surprised to read. What is public opinion on this issue in Alaska?
Well, you're right. I mean, nationally, public opinion is overwhelmingly for protecting the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and I think it's why President Biden made it a campaign priority to protect this area. But in Alaska, it's more mixed because of what you mentioned, not only the permanent fund dividend checks that every man, woman, and child in Alaska gets, not only because Alaska has the no income tax, no state sales tax, a variety of and more subsidies, federal subsidies per capita than any state. There's been a reluctance to make the hard choices about the economic future. So if you told somebody, hey, don't worry about making those painful choices, behind door number 2, we got a great big oil find. It's going to solve all our problems. Whether that's true or not, and more evidence points to the fact that there's not that kind of oil bonanza here. But I think
it's not cost effective potentially even to go get it out. I'm reading.
Potentially, yeah. But you're right that there are probably more Alaskans than not. Some polls have shown do support drilling in this area, and you're right that there are Alaska natives on both sides of this issue, but the Gwich'in Athabascan people who live in Northeast Alaska and Northwest Canada, 8,000 of them, we're living in 15, 16 villages. They have depended for more than 20,000 years on the Porcupine River caribou herd, this longest land migration on the planet, for their subsistence. In some of these villages, 80% of their diet comes from caribou and other wild meat. And
crazy.
They rely on the caribou. The caribou, the scientists tell us, would really be harmed if there's oil drilling in the very area the caribou calve. And that's this precise area they want to drill. They could be displaced from this area. You could see declines in the population, could see caribou shift away from the villages. And over time, you could really see the Gwich'in culture gravely impacted. So they're united in opposing drilling in the Arctic Refuge.
Do you ever think about I asked you about public opinion, but do you and your organization, I think the environmental movement increasingly probably hopefully thinks about that we are defending not only people's interest, but nature's interest. I'm imagining that you must often think about everything from the polar bear to the caribou, to the grasslands, to the 800-year-old trees, and what their interest is. They don't pay you, they don't pay lobbyists or lawyers. How much do you think you're working on behalf of nature that doesn't actually have a human voice or a dollar?
Well, it's a great question, Pete, and I think there's no question that everyone who's fortunate enough to work in for conservation and get to do that professionally is lucky to think about doing the work like that. But I think of it a little less like we're like the Lorax speaking for the trees or the tundra, and more like we're an organization that speaks for the people who care about these places, because I think by and large, there are so many people that do care about what happens to wild landscapes, what happens to wild animals, and do want to ensure that they have a voice. And so the opportunity that all people have to, when you support conservation groups, when you get engaged in conservation groups and fight for the places and causes you care about, you can have a real impact. And make no mistake, even though drilling has passed Congress and the Tax Act was rammed through, even though Trump tore down these things, it's only because of people getting engaged in the process. I mean, I think more than 2 million people spoke out during the Trump administration's environmental review process for the refuge. I mean, there was a massive outpouring of opposition. Only because of that did you see President-elect Biden run on a position of protecting this area. So these are long battles. You have to have a lot of stamina. We're lucky when we take the torch from the last folks who've been doing this and keep going. We've just got to outlast the other side. But we can't afford, to let once the drill rigs are in there, seismic trucks are in there, there's real damage. So we gotta keep after it. We got to get people engaged and inspired and not be complacent just because there's a new president coming in. There's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's a generations-long fight, this fight. And I think that conservationists are going to win this fight because of you and organizations like yours and because of the way that things are changing public opinion and even the economy of energy. But my final question to you is, elections have consequences, and as you just differentiated between the Trump administration, a guy who doesn't believe in science or care about anybody but himself, and Joe Biden, who is going to trust science. The difference, of course, you've got Trump appointing Ryan Zinke and Dave Bernhardt as their interior secretaries. I know people who work in interior. I know who those guys are and what their interests are, and they aren't in the interest of conservation. They try to act like they have a balancing act, but they really are in the interest of dirty fossil fuels, generally speaking. So what does the election change? And how much hope do you have that you can prevent those drills from ever making their way to this pristine tract of land that you've worked your entire career to protect?
Pete, I mean, this is a moment when we have the president-elect ran on a more aggressive pro-environment, pro-conservation, pro-climate action agenda than any other successful presidential candidate in history. I mean, he said we should have no new oil and gas leasing on public lands because we've got to deal with the climate crisis. He said we've got to protect the Arctic Refuge, not just a while, but permanently. He said we've got to look at a big challenge, a big audacious goal of protecting by 2030, 30% of our nation's lands, and oceans. So he's got these huge, big conservation goals, and it's really exciting. They're not all easy to accomplish by executive order. We've got to get some bipartisan support in Congress, but it was encouraging, even if it was crazy. And admittedly, it was crazy given some of the things you said and what we saw in the last administration. But even President Trump was trying to act like he was some Teddy Roosevelt kind of guy talking about conservation. And I think if people, it would be a good thing for us if politicians from both parties were competing with each other about, who could be a better steward for the environment and who's going to be better on conservation. We got to get back to that. There were little glimmers of hope. A couple of little actions. Trump started to back away from this Pebble Mine proposal that would threaten Bristol Bay, another area of Alaska. And I think, again, that's another one that folks really stepped up and spoke out on. Yeah, that was a big win. Yeah. So, we got to keep after that. We got to keep after that bipartisan support, which has been elusive in recent years. But we're hopeful, and it's a big moment, like you said, for change. And we're looking at the environment from a much broader lens, from an environmental justice standpoint, from a bigger climate change standpoint. I think under Biden, there's a lot we can get done over the next 4 years.
Adam Kolton, Executive Director of the Alaska Wilderness League. Hey, I just subscribed to your guys' YouTube page. The videos there really do a great job of capturing the nature. I highly recommend that people subscribe to the YouTube page and support alaskawild.org. Adam Kolton, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. Keep up the great work, and let me know how I can help ever.
Pete, thanks so much. It was great being on.
Adam Kolton, alaskawild.org, alaskawild.org. Very important issue, and hopefully Joe Biden will appoint somebody who is a conservationist to be in charge of the Department of the Interior, which oversees fish and wildlife, which is why I know a lot about it, because I got a lot of friends over there. All right, thank you very much to Adam Kolton for joining me on such short notice about such an important issue. Thank you to Emily Atkin for making me aware of this development in Alaska. Thanks to heated.world. She joined me last week. All right. So next we get to a guy who's quickly becoming one of your favorites. He is an author and a creative writing professor, and he is prolific on Twitter, where he has been warning us about all kinds of what we have, situations and circumstances that we've seen unfold over the last 4 years with Donald Trump. He's an American author, political commentator. He wrote most recently American Rule: How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People. He's also written several other books, including one I just bought and started reading, The Man They Wanted Me to Be: Toxic Masculinity and a Crisis of Our Own Making, which is super interesting. Also, check out his podcast, the Muckrake Podcast, as well as his Patreon. You can support him there. I just love this guy, Jared Yates Sexton, on Twitter at JY Here it is. Will you do?
How it can change your life.
All right, I'm recording now, but will you do your YouTube show? What do you call it? Drinking
Bourbon Talk.
Bourbon Talk. I love it. Will you do that in a robe?
So what's funny about that actually is the day that Trump got COVID,
which is the book I'm writing. But go ahead. Yeah.
That's already got money. I can smell the money.
I just pitched it.
An oral history of the day that Trump got COVID.
I know where I was.
I rolled out of bed, and my co-host, Nick Houseman, he is in California. And so I roll out of bed at 8 a.m. and this dude has already texted me at 5:15 in the morning. He's like, we have to do a podcast. We have to release something real fast. So I threw on a robe and I was like, this is the most like old school journalist thing I can imagine. Like putting on a robe to do an emergency podcast about the idiot president catching this disease.
Well, I have a lot to talk with you about. Thank you for joining me. It's great to see you. It's great to talk to you. You don't
have to thank me at this point. I'm thanking you.
You're continuing to do great work. You've done great work throughout the entire presidential election. You did it on the campaign back in 16. I just want to ask you, because you were a lot of gloom and doom, and I think like a lot of other people who study authoritarianism and autocracy, Sarah Kendzior, Masha Gessen, Jason Stanley, Tim Snyder. I put you in that group of people who studied fascism and autocracy, but you would really studied what America had become. And I think that a lot of what you predicted and analyzed would have happened without the pandemic, without COVID. And I wonder what you think about how close this election was and what the factors were and what might have changed had it not been, in my opinion, for COVID.
I think there are a lot of factors here. We didn't just dodge a bullet. It's like Matrix bullet time. We're still slow motioning as the bullet ripples through space-time. And, it's just touching the jugular. It's right now, it's a matter of where it goes. This thing is so bad. Not just the fact that he gained support, that he gained millions of voters, that he broke into different demographics, but also we're watching a slow-moving, just a completely haphazard, slap-happy coup. Right now. As we're speaking.
I almost feel like at this point, I feel like coup was a lot more effective last week. And now it's like maybe an ooh or just an OU. But it's like it's whimpering a lot. Like I feel like you're giving too much credit. You're connecting the word coup to Rudy Giuliani.
I will say this. It's like there was a coup last week.
Yeah.
And now is the Three Stooges episode.
Right. Yes. That's how
It's the great dictator. It's Charlie Chaplin coming out to make fun of the coup. Because as we're talking, Rudy Giuliani is in front of a court.
Yeah.
And he is a lawyer, technically. He has no idea what he's doing at all. It's really actually quite funny, except for the fact that democracy's on the line. What I'm walking away from this thing realizing is number one, we are so lucky that these people are totally incompetent.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they have no idea what they're doing. And if they found one court, or if they had one legal strategy, if like one more state broke a little bit closer than it did, and by the way, if COVID wouldn't have happened, or if we would have had a second stimulus payment, this would be a completely different conversation, I think. The second thing is, and it's becoming more and more clear to me, that when the history is written, Trump is going to be a precursor. This is going to be a moment that is we're going to look back on it and we're going to say Trump was the point in the road that led to this. Like, I don't think that we're out of the woods by a long shot.
Yeah, I don't think so either, but let me unpack two things you said. Without COVID, without the second stimulus, because without those two things, life would have been better. Life would have been better without COVID, generally speaking, and people would have financially been more secure if there had been another stimulus, therefore maybe making up for the gap in votes. It's hard to know why people voted the way they did, how many did, but I think the point you're making is with this guy getting as many votes as he did in some close elections in certain states, had there not been a pandemic and had people gotten more money in this last couple of months, things might very well have been different. Just want to be clear. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, we would be looking at democracy in absolute tatters. If he wouldn't have won outright with those two conditions, he would have been close enough that these legal attacks might have worked. So we're dodging the bullet, but the bullet is shaving us as it goes by. It's like one of those where we go in with the microscope and we actually see the little white hairs just losing it.
Yeah, we're coming very close, very, very close. I can't now help but think of, I know this is so stupid, but Infinity War with Doctor Strange saying how many chances in a million and whatever he said to Iron Man. But it did feel like that. And it feels like we've got a bit of an extension and an opportunity here, Jared. At least we don't have Donald Trump. And we'll never have anybody like him again, but maybe someone more clever in terms of fascism.
Well, I'll say this. I think a couple of things have happened, and we can more or less chisel these in stone at this point. One thing is we got past Donald Trump, but we can't think in dichotomies anymore. Like, that's something that got us to this point.
Yeah.
The fact that this election happened the way that it did, and the fact that Donald Trump and the Republicans have just decided to live in this alternate reality where the election was stolen, that's part of these people's mythology now. For the rest of time, the Democratic Party stole the election of 2020.
Right.
In the exact same way that when we talk about 2000, we talk about how George W. Bush stole the election from Al Gore. This will define their narratives and their mythologies for forever. The second thing that we have to be very, very aware of, the Republican Party has not escaped the gravity of Donald Trump. And as long as they are enthralled to Trump, and as long as the fascistic movement in this country continues, which I haven't seen anything to tell me that it won't, that means that we are watching fascism and authoritarianism grow in this country. And the question is there somebody more talented, more competent, more intelligent, and actually ideological and also disciplined who's going to follow up in the wake of Donald Trump?
The reason I don't love the usage of the word fascism right now, and it's mainly not my opinion, I don't want to sound smart, Ruth Ben-Ghiat is hesitant to use the word only because we don't have one party rule. I think we have a huge percentage of Americans that want fascism, even though they don't even know what it is, but they want one party rule. They want a fascist state. They want a corporate state almost. But we don't have that. The Democrat won, and the Democratic Party, I would argue, is not a fascist party. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about oligarchy, because I think that's what we definitely still have a huge problem with, a society being run by the wealthiest. What do you think might be the difference in our conversation right now if we split hairs between fascism and oligarchy?
The problem is that we need a new word.
Okay. All right.
And I'm working on this. Don't worry.
Yeah, I leave that up to you. I think that you should do.
I'm in the test kitchen right now. I'm working around. Trumpism gets almost there, but it's not right.
Trumpocracy.
Because one of the things, and I think oligarchy is a really interesting thing, but we have a feature that is a problem here, which is we are speeding towards economic collapse. Capitalism is terminally ill. It's unstable, and it's like watching a train going down the tracks, going way too fast. No one wants to stop it. It's going to derail at some point. The problem, and this is where we get to fascism versus oligarchy. We have an oligarchy. The problem is when fascism, or the problem is when capitalism is getting ready to derail, something has to fix it. Which is what fascists did, is they took an ailing capitalism and they allied themselves with capitalists, because fascism doesn't work if the wealthy and the powerful don't get on board with it, right? Because you have to square the circle on this thing.
Yeah.
So what we're heading towards now is we have a group of fascists who are trying to gain power. We have a group of oligarchs who are making as much money as possible while the getting is good. And we're looking at a derailment, which is where fascism and that meets and takes over. So we can see the accident coming. The question is whether or not we avoid it.
When you talk about an economic collapse and capitalism derailing, can you describe a little bit more about how you think that looks and who it affects? I mean, isn't it class based? Don't the wealthy and upper middle class get away pretty scot free?
Well, it depends. I mean, because what do you see
in your crystal ball?
The conditions seem like they look a lot like the 20s and 30s. I mean, it's a situation where the economy runs hot. This is one of the things that happened, particularly with like the New Deal and the regulations that came through. We had to change our economy. Like this economy has crashed so many times. I mean, even talking about it, Pete, we shouldn't spook it. Let's just be careful. Like, let's not say it too loud. It might hear us. This economy was not designed to work, and there have to be like regulators put on it. Like it has to be saved from itself because it always overheats. And what ends up happening is that it takes over the economy and then it creates within, like we have a lot of people in this country who have no money, who are over leveraged in terms of debt, and they're not going to buy anything. And on top of that, capitalism relies on a constant spreading. It always needs to grow. There's nowhere to grow anymore. Everybody has debt. Nobody can afford anything. If they have one problem, they're done. The housing market is just screwed. And on top of that, I don't know how to tell you this, Pete. I'm glad you're sitting down, and I hope your listeners are as well. There's a climate problem. And we're going to lose land. We're not going to gain land in this whole thing. And people are going to be squeezed and things are going to get bad. So what? Yeah, you should probably open another beer. I think that's the right choice in this case.
So, well, let's talk about the circumstances that underlie that and why that's the case. Were you finished with that point?
I can be. The whole point is it's bad. Because we're in a bad situation, and the elements that are here have been consistent throughout our history. We're speeding towards a derailment, and nobody wants to hit the brakes because you want to make as much money as possible before the very last second. Like there are people right now, as we're talking, who are in a glass meeting room right now having a discussion about what is the point of no return. And can we get right within a hair's breadth? And the problem is when the economy collapses, the fascists are going to be there to pick up the pieces and gain consolidation of power. And that's one thing that we have to be aware of moving forward now.
I want to talk about every single point that you just made, but let me ask you, I want to make sure that I do, because the underlying issues here you've been writing about and talking about a lot, and specific reasons as to why, in this case, instead of saying the economy is collapsing because it's not right now, but it certainly is for a lot of people. A lot of people's lives are very, very tough, including my wife and I. I mean, like the last year has been fascinating for me, terrifying, losing a corporate media job and the health insurance that goes along with it, and trying to go rebuild on my own and not wanting to work for somebody else again has been terrifying. I'm 45 years old, but at least, I can say at least we have certain things. Health insurance wasn't one of them. Luckily, there was a program for people who are independent contractors called Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Luckily for that. But a lot of people are struggling right now. You've been tweeting and talking a lot about student debt. There's some proposals to forgive student debt. So that doesn't get talked about enough, but it's a very easy issue for people to weigh in ethically on. If you made an agreement to pay for this, you got to pay for it. Done deal. That's what my dad says. What is this discussion? Where is student debt an underlying issue here? And where is this coming from, by the way, on Twitter right now, the student debt? Who's made a proposal?
So what has happened is there have been some volleys because the Biden transition team is sort of feeling out what they're going to go into. And there's always a flirtation before a new president takes office. They start to lay out possibilities, and those possibilities fall by the wayside. So, the conversation
trial balloons, personnel.
Right. The beginning of the student debt conversation began with erasure of student debt. Well, the Democratic Party is not going to erase all of student debt. That's just not going to happen, right? And then it got down. Chuck Schumer, which was kind of amazing, came out and said $50,000. $50,000 worth of student debt forgiveness. I mean, not just for me, but a lot of people that I know, it's life-changing. Because what you just said is really interesting, right? Because if I were to lose my job right now, what would I do? And I actually have 2 to 3 jobs. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
if I lost
do.
one of them, like that juggling would be terrible.
Yep.
The student debt that I have and people like me have, it's such a weight on us that if $50,000 were to be taken off, we might buy a house. We might buy a car. We might invest.
You have more money liquid to do everything else with, which is how economics works.
We might open a business.
What would your business be? You're going to sell ice cream and pickles.
Right. And the next thing you know, after you open that business, I don't know. Listen, I know we're getting into advanced economics here. It raises taxes for the government and it creates jobs. So what's happening right now is we have an entire generation of people who, by the way, we got completely screwed over. I'm sorry, but an 18-year-old who doesn't have a college education cannot enter into these contracts. It's unethical. And on top of that, I find it disgusting that the United States government is making money off its citizens trying to go to college. That's madness. So now it's down to $10,000. And let me tell you something. I'll take it. That's fine. But that $10,000 isn't about me. What that $10,000 is actually about is it's a stimulus for the housing market. That's about what people would put down on a house.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So you take the $10,000 away from student debt and people suddenly might start buying it, but they're not going to because we live in such a bad situation. You keep that $10,000, right? You go ahead and you pocket it. And the problem goes back to healthcare. It goes back to education. It goes back to infrastructure. Those projects should have been done decades ago.
Yeah.
They should have been. We should have had universal healthcare decades ago.
Yeah.
We've created a problem within a problem within a problem, and simply throwing pebbles at it isn't going to work. We have to go big. That's the whole point here, is we have so many major crises coming down the pike that we need to go big and bold. And what history tells us is that one of the reasons why fascism takes over in a country is because people feel alienated and powerless. Yeah. And they want to feel more powerful and they want to feel agency. So they get out in the street and they beat people's asses. Yeah. What you need to do is reinvigorate things like the economy. Get the people who join the Proud Boys out building infrastructure. Get them out in the community, working jobs and stuff.
But
and
let's
to work.
I think that's a really good point. So do you like Max Brooks? Do you know who that is? Mel Brooks' son. He's like a national security guy. I can't figure him out, but he was on Real Time the other night saying something similar about just create an opportunity for people is what you need to do. That's how you end an insurgency. Give them jobs. Give them a better life. It was an interesting strategy, and you're saying something similar. But like I feel like the Proud Boys, by the way, are just like 50 guys who just want to go out and fight. They're the kind of guys like, dude, let's go out tonight and fight. And they're not the problem. The problem is the vast majority rest of Trump supporters who are disgruntled for one reason or another. And I think that's who you're, more effectively talking about, giving them opportunity, creating jobs, giving them financial security. And I wonder how we're supposed to reach out to them now. That's my question to you, Jared. Like, how do we unify with these people who don't share the same exact baseline reality on truth as we do? We've come so far apart, including my next door neighbor and I.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I have to tell you that who you're talking about is also my relatives. They're the people I grew up with, right, in my community and all that. And I've thought a lot about it. We don't do this thing where we go into diners and we're like, what do you think about this issue? Because what they think is bullshit, Pete. They don't know what they're talking about. They're talking about propaganda. They're talking about alternate realities that don't exist. I think you come in the back door. You do things that maybe help them or better their lives, and you lower the temperature a little bit, right? So like, for instance, one of the things that I've been floating, and I've been telling everyone who will listen that is even within Biden's orbit right now, do a major jobs program in middle America. I'm telling you, people don't want to go out and burn synagogues if they have to go to work the next day. if they're worried about making a mortgage payment. So one of the things that
you guys want to go burn the synagogue down? I would, but I have to go build this solar panel array tomorrow that I have a job at. I can't do that tonight because that is great. And it's a great job, and I like doing. I don't want to go to jail. Also,
because I'll tell you what happens.
What's a synagogue? Really committed to that.
They're like, hey, do you want to go commit a hate crime? And somebody's like, no, I got a windmill shift tomorrow.
Right.
Wait, what's a windmill? And they're like, oh, I'm getting paid like $24 an hour to make windmills. And they're like, are they hiring?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, by the way, they're drinking craft IPAs and they're having conversations.
By the way, when you said windmill shift, it did absolutely sound like a guy who lives in the windmill, like a lighthouse keeper. I mean, that's not how.
I'm open to options, Pete. So the whole point of this is, and this is the problem I think that a lot of people have missed out on. People will disbelieve in climate change. They'll disbelieve in COVID. They'll disbelieve in all of that when they have a political incentive to disbelieve in those things. If they have an economic incentive, I'm telling you, if you go into the Rust Belt and you start going into like alternative energy solutions, or I don't know, you start employing unemployed people to contact trace COVID, I'm telling you right now, they suddenly believe in climate change and COVID. Like, we're doing the wrong thing. We're trying to battle in a trench warfare situation with talking points back and forth. That doesn't work. You have to come in the back door. You have to make material situations better. And if you do that, you change everything about this country. It just so happens that it's not the route we've been going for the longest time. I
mean, we could have a jobs program in the Rust Belt that ramps up the manufacturing of electric cars, for which I've owned since 2011. And I know so much about it. I'm so frustrated with how expensive they are because I want to buy a new car right now. And it's just like, it's so, I cannot possibly, with a clear conscience, buy a car with a combustion engine. I'm an early adapter to all these, renewable energy solutions in my home with solar panels, in my car with an electric car. I have a Chevy Volt, and now I got to get a new car, and they're too expensive, Jared. They're too expensive, electric cars. Why is there not a massive Marshall Plan for electric automobiles? It's being left to the private sector, and only people of a certain income can afford them.
So here's the thing
and they're cool as fuck. Like, people are like, oh, my muscle car is my combustion engine. The electric cars are faster, period.
They're awesome.
They're like jet engines. They take off.
All of this stuff, it goes back to the conversations that we haven't been having that we need to have. So here's the thing. You want to talk about like oil companies, right? They know climate change is real. They've known climate change was real since the 1970s.
Yeah.
They knew it before most scientists knew it. It's their job to know it. They have a file right now in their offices. They're like, where is peak oil? And when do we switch over to alternative energies? And you want to talk about like the automobile manufacturers? They know the money right now is in combustion engines. If we can change culture based on economic incentives, all of these people are ready to move. They know that there is a domino point, a tipping point in all of this stuff. It's just waiting for it. We have to start having a bigger imagination in this country because there's two options. We can have a country that is total austerity, where whoever is in power punishes the other group, right? It's like, screw y'all, we're going to pay for lattes this month.
Yeah.
The other one is like, no, we're going to go down into the mines. Like, we can't live like that. We have to radically change this country. And the thing is, it will actually help everybody and it will cool off temperatures. But people have to be bold. They have to be ambitious. And that's something Democrats haven't been good about.
And I want to get into that with you at some point, what Democrats need to do. But I mean, today, and I'm embarrassed to say that I hadn't before, bought your book, The Man They Wanted Me to Be. And because I started looking up, I was like, I really want to start digging deeper into masculinity and individualism and these different ideas, because I think that they are what undergird so much of the attitude. And I'm already hooked on this book. And I am falling even deeper in love with you and having more of an understanding of who you are by reading it. But what I wanted to ask you is, based on what you know and what you've written with that book, and all of the rest of your work, I feel like the mask debate illustrates it all, Jared. And I wonder if you could explain to me, because it's that masculinity, it's the individualism of don't tell me what to do. It's the anti-elitism of science. It's a lot of those things, all illustrated by whether or not you will wear a mask. How do we convince people to wear a mask, knowing all of the underlying issues that I just mentioned that you've written so much about? Do you feel like it's a good question? They're a good, not metaphor, but symbol of all of what you've been talking about, the mask debate.
Pete, would you say it's a question of masculinity?
It's perfect.
I sat on that for a minute. I wanted to get to that.
I feel like we should launch a podcast with that name.
Listen, that would tear up. Let's just be honest. That would eat
It's only got 6 months left on it, because hopefully we won't be wearing masks. And
I will say the mask thing is absolutely steeped in debate, because here's the thing. I think that we kind of screwed this whole appeal thing up. If I would have been in charge of public health trying to get men to wear masks, first and foremost, men like to define themselves based on their ability to face danger, right? There's a reason why they're racing down the highway in their muscle cars, or they're taking risks with their health or whatever. What they're actually doing is they're overcompensating for their own insecurity. So I think first and foremost, I think we missed an opportunity, which is when you go out there and you're facing death, right? Just this idea that you're showing strength and leadership.
Right.
But what it ended up being is that you're wearing a protection device, and you're in danger, and you need to take care of yourself, and you need to watch out for your neighbor. And I feel like the rhetoric of that was exactly the opposite of what American men were going to hear. And I think that we missed an opportunity. I have to tell you, for the men in my life, I started buying them masks with skulls on them, barbed wire on them, flames, and they wore them because they're always looking for some sort of expression of strength.
Two actual guns on each side?
If we could put a holster on the masks, I think we would take care of this whole situation.
A Mandalorian flamethrower?
I think we'd be holster. Done. But the problem is that a lot of American men are so insecure that to wear a mask would be to admit that they're mortal and that they're vulnerable. And to do that would be tantamount to death, because masculinity is so fragile.
I know, but explain that to me, because the joke I went on one day, I sent 15 tweets. None of them were great as usual, but it was firemen who use hoses are pussies. The catcher in a baseball game who wears a cup is weak. Scuba divers with scuba tanks are losers. We do all kinds of things that are dangerous, but we use equipment to make them a little safer, so that jumping out of an airplane with a parachute is for pussies. I don't, by the way, like the word pussy to reflect weakness, because I think pussies are very strong because they can push babies through them. And I think men, dicks are very weak because you just graze balls and you want to throw up. But
this is the content I came onto this podcast.
Anyway, I'm done talking. But why is the mask make me weak? How is their strength to overcome the flu, a very bad virus?
A part of what you said, I think, really fits in here, which is insecure men don't like experts, because to kowtow to an expert means that somebody else knows more than you, or somebody else is lording over you. And what we should have done, I'm sorry, I know that it's so lame, but in a world that actually worked, you would have invited an NFL quarterback up onto the podium, or Dwayne Johnson to come out, after a couple of reps, coming out and just looking swole with it. But the problem is that Trump, who, by the way, is the personification of American masculinity. He is, and you know, he likes to pretend he's so tough. He's such a wuss, man.
Yeah. He's never sweat. He's never bled. He's never even been injured because that would require some kind of physical exertion. He got out of the wars. He's an unbelievable. He's not a good athlete. I'll stop.
At the heart of it, here's the truth. And this is like one of the things, it took me a very long time to figure this out. And it's what The Man They Wanted Me to Be is about, which is, I always thought that I was alone. I thought I was a freak because I was a sensitive guy who didn't live up to the quote unquote masculine ideal. Well, what I found out was all of the men that I was afraid of and all the men that I looked up to who I thought were strong and stoic, it turns out that they all felt like they were failing, and because masculine ideal doesn't exist. So that insecurity means that men have to overcompensate. It's why they're aggressive. It's why they're angry. It's why they can't express their emotions. They won't go to the doctor. And they mistreat people around them. Donald Trump is somebody who is so insecure that he's a broken man. And this is what everybody's heading towards if they don't recognize that they can be open, they can be vulnerable, they can still be men.
But I just want to clear that up because I think it's a really good point. You're saying that had there been any other president, Republican or Democrat, man or woman even, there would have been a similar campaign where they would have rolled out the most masculine of celebrities and said, wear a mask, as opposed to Donald Trump, who refused to wear one himself, number one, and number two, ridiculed them. And what that did, and it created this paradigm or this narrative that gave all of his right-wing hosts, from Don Bongino to Sean Hannity, Lorraine Graham, or however the fuck her name is pronounced, this thing to talk about every day and point to, and this mass debate, just another thing to be divisive over. But almost any other politician, Republican or Democrat, man or woman, would have been like, wear a fucking mask so we don't get this.
That is exactly what should have happened, because there's a couple of things that we can look at here, which were missed opportunities. What you have to understand about masculinity is so much of this stuff is not just insecurity, but it's psychological. So much of this stuff is like deep-seated psychosexual.
Right. Yeah.
There's a problem with signs that say, please, if you can, wear a mask if at all possible.
Right.
And we really suggest that you wear a mask. And if you can't, there should have been signs everywhere that said, put a fucking mask on. And by the way, I think men would have ended up getting into a point where these insecure men would have ended up actually bullying people who didn't wear masks. Like, there would have been a weird thing that would have taken place. The second part, and I've been telling people this left and right, I've worked with people for like gun control, gun reform, all of this stuff. Here's the secret. You have to override the masculine impulse with a different masculine impulse. So instead of like, okay, with guns, right, it's about protecting your family. No, the bigger masculine impulse is sacrifice. Are you strong enough to give something up? So like, for instance, do you want your family to be safe from mass shootings? Well, you might have to sacrifice some of your rights to carry semi-automatics. And all of a sudden it's like, do you remember when your grandfather carried a semi-automatic into Europe? Now you might need to give up your semi-automatic in America. And I think that there are appeals here that we have totally missed out on because so many people think masculinity is just wired in. It's not. It's a psychological condition. It's not natural.
It's not?
Some is. Some of it is. But the masculine ideal, the modern masculine ideal is all set up in the industrial age, which is one of the reasons why we're in this situation. Men were taught that their lives didn't matter. They shouldn't complain. You show up to work and then you go home and you sleep and then you go back to work. That was in order to go work in factories, to be maimed in factories, to give your bodies up to factories. Well, guess what? We don't have factories anymore. And by the way, we don't have another world war anymore. So you have a bunch of men who aren't able to express themselves through their labor. Well, what do now? They buy big, giant trucks. They adorn them with fascist symbols. Yeah. They wear fascist outfits and they go out and they march and they, I don't know, shoot at protesters. It's a one-to-one replacement, unfortunately.
You actually have a line about that in the intro of The Man They Wanted to Be, about how the economy has changed from whatever you just described, working in factories, to, you know, working in an office, sitting in front of a computer, which does not have anything to do with, if anything, the gender undertones or overtones are feminine, sitting at a computer typing. That's what a secretary does.
Talking in a meeting, coordinating with your colleagues, communicating about ideas and goals and compromises. Like that, these things are not things that men have been told they're supposed to do or trained to do.
This book is so good. I'm really enjoying it. It's really interesting. The Man They Wanted Me to Be. And I, when I get done with it, I want to have a whole book talk with you. And we've talked a lot about American Rule. We should still talk even more specifically about it, chapter by chapter. I would, because it's such a good book, your most recent work. But I had forgotten that you wrote that book until I started doing a search on masculinity in books, and I was like, oh my God, Jared wrote this book. So I bought it right away, and I think it's just it's really important work. That work is the underlying psychological stuff that we so desperately need to address. And Jared, the last thing I'll say is I have found in my career in talking on the radio openly about just everything, there are so many men and women who are really interested in that subject matter and that content. And so my final question is, what was the reaction to that book, and how did it affect you, The Man They Wanted Me to Be?
I'll tell you the honest God truth. The effect, first and foremost, that book wore me the hell out. Like getting my laundry out in the world, my own.
Yeah, being so vulnerable and transparent. Yeah.
Ooh, it was a lot. But I have to tell you, it was the harassment that I got and the vitriol that I got was equal to my political writing.
Oh, wow.
But the other part was having people who reached out to me. It was really kind of incredible and really emotional too, man. It was like the amount of people who would reach out and they'd be like, I never knew anybody else felt like this. I now understand my husband, my brother, my son. Yep. And I've actually had conversations with men who, dude, they were on a path to suicide and self-ruin, and they were they were being abusive. And I've talked to fascists who stepped away from the abyss simply because they realized that they had been recruited and radicalized based on an insecurity they didn't need to have. So it was really rewarding. But I have to tell you, man, it is a big, giant, massive, exhausting topic.
I think I can relate to some extent because I'm not much of a writer, but I've said pretty much everything into this microphone, this actual microphone. So I think I can relate, and it's brave and it's great work, really great work. I'm so enjoying it. It is cathartic, and then I can relate it. And I was really excited to talk to you for the first time tonight since having started, just beginning to read The Man They Wanted Me to Be. Go get it, everybody. Jared, I'll let you go. It's so great talking to you always. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, sir.
You're the best, man.
There he goes, Jared Yates, Sexton. Listen to his podcast, the Muckrake Podcast. Support him on Patreon. Get his books, both of the ones I just mentioned that we just talked about. Really great. Always love talking with him. Thank you also to Adam Kolton at the Alaska Wilderness League. And thank you to you for supporting this podcast with your paid subscription. If you haven't signed up yet, you got to know this is free, but it's not cheap. It's a lot of work every day. I put in a tremendous amount of work to make this podcast happen. I do it entirely myself. It is my full-time job, and I could really use your support. We have almost 800 subscribers, so I'd love for you to subscribe. I'd love for you to join me on Thursday night, tomorrow night, and the Zoom Hangout, and anytime on the Discord platform so that you're never alone, because now more than ever, we need to stay connected. We need community, and that is what we are building. The stand-up community would love to have you be a part of it, and hope to see you at the Zoom Hangout tomorrow night. I love you. You're not alone. I will talk to you tomorrow right here on Stand Up.